Okay, good morning or afternoon, everyone. My name is Brittany. I will be doing the invoice and estimate layouts call today. A few housekeeping notes is the recording will be available usually in a couple of days in that webinar section in the help guide. So if you're in that support.workamajig.com website, you have the webinars link here. We would be in 2022. These are upcoming, so obviously one of those is going to be what's future. And then down here would be the actual recording for today's webinar. So if you missed it, if you missed part of it, or if a buddy missed it, you can always send them that link. So with invoice layouts, there is going to be a couple of options for security, right? So not everyone is going to see invoice layouts. I'll show you what I'm talking about. If we go to your menu, you have admin, if you have access, and then system setup. Your invoice layouts are going to be under billing options, or if you just type in like estimate or invoice, you start typing it in, it'll narrow it down. So again, it's under those billing options there, and you're actually going to see two different options whenever we're in billing options. So you're going to see invoice and estimate templates here. This is the non-designer tool. It's a little bit easier to use. So if you need basic invoice or estimate layouts, these are definitely what we recommend. Some of you will only see these options. You actually won't see the invoice and estimate layouts. If you're a newer client, typically this is something that you have to turn on. So if for one, you're not even seeing this option, then we need to go to transaction preferences and turn it on. So your transaction preferences are in account information. So as soon as you get to system setup, it's here. Otherwise, again, if you're not sure where, you can always use that search option, and then you would find what you're looking for here. Once you get into here, you might be seeing kind of some basic information. If you don't see the options of breakdown of projects and clients and all of that, then you typically have a show advanced options here. Okay, so if you don't see this, then you're probably seeing the breakdown of each different section. So you either have hide or you have show, so just be mindful of that. And then when you get to estimates, you're going to see the option for enable the advanced invoice and estimate layouts. That's what's going to get us that billing option, invoice and estimate layouts. So again, it's only in this estimate section. If this is unchecked for you, then you're only seeing the older tool where you basically just get check boxes of what do you want to see and what don't you want to see. So this gives you that option if it's not already there. So then I mentioned these kind of being the older, easier tool. So if you're looking for an invoice template, when you come into them, typically detailed and summary are the two options that default in. Okay, so these are the ones that we kind of set up just to give an idea of what these could be, or maybe a starting point to work from. If I go into detailed, again, these ones are a lot easier. So you can just name it if you need to. Active versus inactive, meaning did we just want to deactivate this invoice template because we no longer use it? That's what that would mean. And then for line options, do I want to show quantity description or not? What lines am I showing? Just top level, summary, or all lines? And then you're basically just going through and it's asking you, what do you want to show and what don't you want to show? So obviously I won't go through each one of these, but they will give you details of how detailed should this invoice layout be. So you go all the way down the list, figure out what you want, figure out what you don't want, and then of course you would see things like hide. Okay, so a lot of different options here. And then the next part is actually choosing fonts and where does your logo go. So then you would click over to layout. You can insert some sort of logo here if you need it. And then where does that logo fall? Typically, I recommend keeping these as they are because they probably should be pretty good, pretty set up for what you need. So only change these if once you print this, it's not showing up or you want a little bit more spacing than what you see, then go ahead and change them. But when you're doing this, you're making small corrections. And I mean small like changing the 8 to a 6 instead of maybe moving a 1 to all the way down to a 2 or up to a 2. That's huge changes. So just make really small ones. Again, maybe I put this to a 6 instead of an 8. Those are what I'm talking about, is making just little minor changes to them. And then if you wanted to choose, if you had different, so my test site has a couple of different addresses. Which address did you want that to show from? There's typically a header labeling the actual invoice. Do you call it an invoice, or some people call it something else? Or do you want to just remove the label altogether? You can remove it altogether. And then what font does this fall under? Where does it go? Then the last section is all of the fonts, right? So if we're talking the address and the header and the summaries and the lines, all of that, what font does it fall under? Is what size do you want it? And then do you want either or any of those bold and italicized? So again, these are a lot easier to use. These ones are going to get you a lot of information, or as little information as you want, without having to do a whole lot of maneuvering and changing. So it's basically a, do you want this? Yes or no? And then that's what you get. So those are going to be your invoice and the estimate. It's basically the same thing, right? So you're just indicating what do you want to show. This one will give you the option of doing like a footer. So a lot of people have some sort of footer that they want in there. So you can put whatever your footer is, copy and paste it into there. And then that of course would show on every layout. And you still have that layout section over here. So again, nothing different. People might change the estimate name to quote or statement of work, or the many different names for an estimate. That's what you're going to get to do the display text there. So again, those are a little bit easier to use. And then once you have those set up, if you have a specific client or client type that you want to use that particular layout, this is my actual client name, right? So this is an actual client in my system. And I know it's a client because it'll have client details. Otherwise, it might be a vendor or just a company in the system. So client details, you have these billing options here. Under this, you'll see those two different options. So I mentioned invoice and estimate layouts. Those are the easier ones. If that's what we need for this particular client, then you can go ahead and choose, well, what's the estimate template that we would want them to use? What's the invoice template that we would want them to use? Okay, so this is where you can default that in. Once you do that, every project that you create for this particular client would then default with this as the template. Okay, now obviously on one-off situations or on a per invoice or estimate basis, you can go in and change it. So it's not like you're stuck using that particular template. It will just go off of whatever you have. And then if we needed to change it because maybe there's a different one that would work better for what they need for that project, then you can go ahead and change it on the actual invoice or the estimate. Okay. Any questions so far? So one person says, can you please show how to replace a logo on an invoice without changing the size or placement? Yes. So if I am back into the invoice section, go to one of those, you're actually just going to remove the logo. And then when it's no longer there, you say add a logo file. It pulls up your computer, and then you can go in and put whatever logo would fit best. So if I put that in there, then there's my logo. So I don't have to change really the location of it, but you're basically, if there's one existing, go ahead and just click on the remove. If there never was one in the first place, then usually, and I might have, yeah, so it'll just show up as add a logo file. Otherwise, if you don't, then obviously a logo just won't show on there. And then it kind of looks like a empty space. So typically, I'm assuming everyone would want their logo, but that's where it would go. Okay. So any other questions right now? Okay. So then I want to jump back to system settings. Not everyone is going to have options to go in and actually edit the layouts. So it is something that you do have to have admin manager. There's not really a way around that. And then you have to have system set up in order to do that. When you're in those security settings, If I collapse, we go to system admin. Maintain setup information gives us the access to at least get into system setup. Okay, so that's what gives this dot. And then depending on what access you have or what you're given, you might have all of these options or just a few of them. So when we're in those security settings, you need at a minimum that billing options section, right? So if I come down, edit billing options, this is ultimately, and when you click on it, it'll even tell you that it's going to give you those layout options, right? So at a minimum, we have to have this edit billing options checked. You don't necessarily have to have everything else, but usually it's on a per module basis. I'm considering all of these like global list, contact management. Those are kind of each module. So you can go in and just give billing options to someone if they just need to go in and do all the items in here. Now we don't really have the option of saying, okay, well, just some of the billing options. It is an all or nothing. So whenever you give edit billing options, that is going to give you everything within billing options, which would be billing items, billing groups, sales tax, payment methods, all of those different options. So if you're given this right, then you have all of those rights for that particular section. So that's what's going to give us those options in order to go in and actually edit the invoice layouts. Now, if I want to go in and take a look at what my layouts look like, then what I recommend is have an invoice that's typical. So if you have a project that you build and it's the usual way that you bill it, you want to see what the layout looks like, then I would go in and find one of your actual previous invoices, right? So I'm going to go through the magnifying glass. You have that views section and you would need client invoices. I'm just going to go to an all option. And then if I want to narrow it down, I can. Otherwise, if I just kind of want to look for something recent, then maybe I would come into this particular one. Click on the details. So your little pencil next to details. And then you have your invoice templates here. So these are those other the easier ones because we haven't quite got into the detailed ones. So when you have two different layouts set, this one's going to win as far as which one does it choose. Okay, so the newer tool will always default over the old tool. Okay, so if I want to see what my detailed one looks like, then I need to just get rid of this altogether, have it be nothing. And so this one's going to be detailed. There's not a whole lot on here in general, so I might not have the best example, but when I go in and print it, then I have, it's giving me the creative direction, which is a service in here. So it's actually going through and detailing out some of the detail of this actual invoice. Okay, so that's what it looks like. There's where my logo is. This is the verbiage that I was talking about. Some people remove it all together if they want to, others do not. They'll leave it and call it an invoice, or maybe there's different names for it. But you do have those options in there. So this is what my detailed one looks like so far. If I don't like it, then typically what I would do is recommend having two tabs open at the same time, so I can quickly keep printing as I need it. And so what I would do is on this new one that I opened up, I'd go back to those layouts and continue to work them. So back to the billing options, I'm in an invoice, so I would go, I'd click into here and say, okay, let's go ahead and show, you know, maybe the hours and the rate. And maybe that's it. So if I go in and save that, then when I reprint this, then I should see more information. So my hours and rate came in. So I can say, okay, that looks good. And again, just continue to work those. Now, if you're wondering what the test 1, test 2, test 3, there's these user defined fields. Some people just kind of free type in there with what they want. And then you see those up here, right? So it's more of just additional information that you can choose to add to the actual layout if you need to. Okay, so again, recommend having two tabs open. One be the actual invoice that you're working from, and then one be the actual layout so that you can choose what is it that you actually want to show, how does that look once we do it, and then continue to work. There's a question of the rights are only by security group or can they be set by individual? Yes, you're correct, only by security group. So if someone needs to be a little bit different than everyone else, then you're going to copy their current security group and then give them a new group and then put them in it. So first thing would be creating the group. And you'll notice that you can never just add a new one. You actually have to copy from an existing one anyway. So when I'm in the security groups, next to each of these, if you're highlighted on it, you'll notice there's a copy of this group. There's no plus button to add a new one. We're never going to have you start from scratch. So typically, let's say they're in like the purchasing group, you want them to have a few more rights than what this group actually has. You go in, you make that copy. It'll say, okay, we copied it. So now it creates the duplicate. You would go in, add the additional rights that that particular group would need. So if I'm talking billing options, we give them billing options. So we've created the group at least, and then you'd go into the employee records and put that person in that new group. Obviously, you probably want to change the name of it. So then what I would do is on the right-hand side, so we're in the copy, we've highlighted on that, click in, and you might call it advanced purchasing manager, right? Advanced PM or something like that. So then now you have advanced PM versus regular PM, and then assign that person to that particular group. Okay. Someone is asking, where do you add client address, email, phone number so it can be reflected? If you're talking on the client side, that is actually going to be on their client record, right? So if I go back into, this is my client, right? Oops. Then their address information is going to be here, right? So if I'm in just that client details that typically opens up, if I want their address to reflect, I would say, okay, address goes in here. And then any of their phone number or that type of detail, I think is going to be in here. So you have your main phone number and a couple of other different options that you can choose in there. So either company info here for the phone number, and then their addresses are going to be here. And then on the invoice itself, in your details, you can choose what address you want to use, right? So this particular one doesn't have an address. If I go into his record, he doesn't have an address, right? So that's why it's not really showing anything. I don't even think there's a phone number. So obviously those two pieces of information are missing on this particular one, but it's in the actual client record that you're going to set that information. And then if they have multiple addresses and this one is defaulting to the wrong one, then again, you click on the drop down, and if they have multiple addresses, you would typically see those there. Same with the contact information. So again, probably a bad example because there's not a whole lot to this particular record, but typically you have at least one contact on a client record. If not, that's fine, but most of the time you do, and then that might default their name in the company information as well. Okay, so their question is on the invoice template, do you click on the insertion tab? What can you change in there? So the insertion order is if you're actually setting up, so if you're actually billing insertion orders, right? So this is kind of on the pre-bill side of things rather than billing the vendor invoice that comes in. It's how do you want the invoice detail if you're actually showing it? How do you want it to show? So what would we group it by, and do we subtotal for that group? Are there multiple groupings? If so, then obviously you're going to choose different options within each one. And then what are my columns? Right, so you can have things like the add caption. If you click on the drop down, here's all of the different options that you might have. Otherwise, if you don't really want all of the detail, you have the hide detail option in there. But this is basically just saying, well, if you build the actual orders, and it's going to be the same for broadcast order, you're going to have those different options within the broadcast realm. It's just basically, do you want to have more details than what the invoice layout has currently? Okay, so that's the old and layouts. And again, your estimates are going to be similar, just more on the estimate information side is what you're going to get as far as, well, how do we display it? So usually there's a one-line option. This would be very summary, right? If you just want to give them an estimate that is just one line, most of the time that's not the case, but if they don't really care and they just need to know the total, one line works great. Otherwise, if you want them to see detail by task, then when you create your estimate, and we'll go into this in a bit, but when you create the estimate, you actually have to have it going by task. So when you create an estimate, it'll ask you what line detail do you want? Do you want by task and service, by task only, by service only, and then by task and person is the last option. If you're choosing something that doesn't have task in it, this is not going to work out. You cannot choose by task if you're not building an estimate by task, right? Makes sense, but some people say, what? Well, you have to actually do an estimate by task. By service, again, you can't just do task only if you have an estimate template that you're going to do by service. So it has to match up, right? Makes sense. But what would you want it to show? By task, by service, by person, by billing item? Billing item and item is basically saying, okay, we have groupings for my items, and my items might be services. My items might actually be like actual expenses, right? So if you have expenses in the system, you can group things together, and that's called billing items. But if I have some that are grouped together by item, and then others are going to be grouped together by billing item and item, then that would be this option. So I'll go into those billing options just a little bit. Mostly that's on the billing side, but what I'm talking about is you have billing items. Okay, so for mine, I have things like media, reimbursed out of pocket, other outsourced, I have production, and then professional services. Where this rolls down to is the different items that I have in the system, which again could be services. So here's all of my services. Do I want the option to group those together? So if I don't want on one of my layouts to list out account management, general admin, and art, and all of these different labels, you can have them grouped together and just call it professional services or whatever your billing item is. So I have 3 that are grouped up, the rest of them are not. If I did by billing item and item, if I have these 3 on my invoice or my estimate, it's going to lump them under professional services. If I add any of these other ones, it's going to list them out individually because I don't have them grouped under a billing item. It's going to be the same for your purchase items. Okay, so purchase items, you would have a billing item option. And if I don't have it on, here's my billing items, right? So a couple of these are media. The others I consider to be out of pocket, or I have outsourced, or I have services. So you'll notice that a lot of these, or if you kind of open it up, it'll tell you what the billing item is. So telephone is under reimbursed out of pocket. So that's where you're getting the billing item option, or what that is basically a grouping option. Okay, so now we've talked about these older tools. The bigger one, or kind of the more difficult one to use because it has more options, is going to be this invoice and estimate layouts option. So when I click into here, we did default in because really you don't want to start these from scratch. They're so involved that typically you at least want to start somewhere. So my recommendation is to, again, use a invoice that is typical of how you would bill, right? So how detailed you went in and build it, what's on there, so that we have examples to look at. I would always recommend having one that is typical, and then go through and take a look at the ones that we did default in. So you're going to kind of read it to see, okay, well, this is estimate and invoices. So if it says invoices, then I get to use it. If it's estimate only, so this one says estimate, that means that this invoice would not print out because we didn't set up the invoice side of it. Okay, so don't choose something that is estimate only. Okay, you want to do one that's estimate and invoice because this is an invoice, so we need to have the invoice set up. But it'll say it's subtotaling, and it does billing item and item. So the level of detail that we're getting is the ability of having it show the actual details. So the billing items and or the items. So when I choose that and hit save, now when I print this out, it should look a lot different than what it was before. So there's my logo. This is the company. If I had the company address, I would see that here. I would also see billing information. This is my company's name and information here. And then again, you get some general information. I only have creative direction on that layout, so but it is giving me that total. And then I have things like taxes. I have the labor and expense totals, if there were any, what was the non-tax. So you have kind of this summary section in here. So if you say, okay, well, this looks pretty good, let's go ahead and start from here. Great. Then you can go in and actually open it up. So click out of here, and then find that one that you were working on. So then you can go in and actually edit it. Otherwise, there is a quicker way to do it. If you click out of here, in your details, it's actually hyperlinked. So if I click on this, this will open up the actual details. But the reason I don't do that faster link is because I'm not seeing as much information as I am here, right? It's taking up more space because it opened up another sliding window. So that's the main reason. And again, I want both open at the same time. So you can go in and see the one thing, the bigger thing is people will be like, oh, I made all these changes over here. We're on the estimate side. This is an invoice. I need to be on the invoice side in order for that to really show through, right? So this is really what I need to work from, okay? So that's where you can see, or what detail you can use to determine, well, what does it look like, is kind of switch through, take a look at each one and figure out what's my starting point, what is closest to what I need to show for this particular invoice. Now, obviously I have a ton of formatting to do on this one. I was probably playing around and seeing, well, what does each of these fields do? So this one looks horrible, right? I probably wouldn't start from this one, but when you guys are looking at those defaults, they should be brand new. If you don't have your defaults, we can add them in, but you'll need to ask your account manager. So email into your support at workamajig.com, ask them to add in the default layouts, and they can do that for you. One caveat for that is if you went in and edited the ones that we have, and maybe you didn't change the names, we'd have to go in and change the names of the current ones that you have in the system so that the new ones will actually go in. So just keep that in mind, but you can email. See, this is exactly what I did. I put an 11 next to one of them so I could bring in the defaults again. Just any small change would then allow me to bring in some of those defaults again. So that's why you see some of them with the name that's basically similar, but I added in an 11 at the back of it because I wanted to bring in the defaults again. Okay, so find one that's most similar to what you want to accomplish and then work from that. So first order of business is I would go in and make a copy. Leave our defaults as they are, just in case you completely mess it up or you don't like what it was. You know, you can then just kind of delete that new one that you created to then go back and maybe copy from this, the defaulted one again. Okay, so don't edit ours, go in and make a copy. Someone had a question of, can you subtotal by segment? Yes and no, because the campaign billing is a little bit newer. That is something that we have in the pipeline. So it's not fully built out yet to where when you look on the options for the layout, you won't see segment as an option to pull in just yet. So in here, how to create a new one or copy from one of ours, you're just going to use the plus button here and you're going to say copy existing, right? Otherwise, again, you're starting from scratch. This is definitely not what we recommend. Otherwise, it's a blank slate and you're going to start 100% over. So copy existing as much as possible. What do you want to call the layout? And then which one do you actually want to copy from, right? So I'm just going to call this our webinar test. In here, we'll show all of the options that you have, right? So if I said I want to start from this one, and then what do I use? Do I copy everything? If so, then do that. If I'm not copying over the estimate, because this is just going to be an invoice layout, then you can uncheck this, or you can leave them both checked if it's going to be an invoice and estimate layout that we're going to be editing. Okay, so you have options on what do you copy over. I typically recommend just copying everything. And then what happens is, here is our layout, right? So it's the webinar test. So we're not in the original one or the defaulted one that we add into the system, but now I can go in and edit. You can choose to work on the estimate side, but since we're kind of focused on the invoice side, I want to go into the invoice section to then go in and actually edit it. Okay. Couple of things over here. We'll just kind of go down the list. This is obviously the save button. So if you've made changes, you can go ahead and save it. If you want to undo something that you did, you have an undo and a redo option. You can zoom in or zoom out either by clicking on this, or of course you can click on the plus button, or you can slide it yourself. So however it works best for you, you can go ahead and do that. And then properties, this is typically when we're clicked on a field, right? So there's no properties because we're not really pointing to anything in particular. But if I said, okay, click on client, now we actually see some properties. So it's basically telling you it's a field, it's a data field, and it's coming from client name. So anytime you see an @ it's pulling from information in the system. Okay, so this is a perfect example. This one just reads billing contact. This is more like a label, meaning it's going to say, okay, billing contact. And then this is @ billing contact, which means that this field will look to the invoice. We'll look to see who is the actual contact up here. And then it would then say, okay, if it was Ron Burgundy on my layout, I would see billing contact, Ron Burgundy. Okay, so the @ means that it's pulling from a specific field in the system. You can change the fonts for each field, right? You go through, click on whatever font that you want, and it'll go ahead and change it. You can see what that would actually look like right there. I'm going to change it back to Arial if I can find it. There we go. You can also change sizes, right? So obviously you could just go in and figure out what size you want, bold or italicized, and is it going to be underlined? You have alignment, so it's going to the left, but of course you have center or you have to the right. So you'll see what changes those we're making. Word wrap is going to be very important for fields like comment fields, right? So my header comment, or maybe even a project description or something like that, they typically have lots and lots of words, or they can have lots of words. So usually for those, you do want it to word wrap. Most of the time, I think it defaults in whenever you bring in that field. So you do have that option, and I almost recommend it for everything, just in case, because maybe your project name is long or maybe your project description is long. So typically this is defaulting in, but word wrap is definitely essential for if you have very big fields. You also have, what is the background? Is there a border in general? What border color should it be? Should there be some sort of shadow? And then if we have borders, do we want it everywhere, or do we want it on the left, the right, the top, the bottom? Where is it on the grid, right? So usually you're not changing it here. You're probably just moving it here and then dropping it, and then it'll go ahead and change those for you. Can shrink and grow is also going to be an important one as well. What this does is, right now you see my project description is really only one line and couldn't really fit that much. So I probably need this field to expand out as much or as little as it can. So can shrink and can grow allow it to say, okay, well, if we have no project description, let's say that this field was a fairly large field. I'm going to move this out a bit and move these down. If my project descriptions are typically long, then a lot of times I want a decent size box in here to accommodate for that. And so you're going to have the invoice showing kind of this big box in here if I don't have it shrink and grow. So if my project description is one line, it would say, you know, here's the project description. Well, then it's going to have all this extra space in here if I don't have can shrink and can grow. okay, because it's not allowing it to ebb and flow. So if this is unchecked, whenever I save this and go in and print something, if I have a pretty short description, I'm still going to see a big pause in my invoice for allowing this big box that we've created. So can shrink and grow is also something that you typically want to have turned on. Okay. Settings, I don't find that a lot of people are editing these for the most part, and it's kind of for the layout as a whole. So, you know, what format do I want? What are the page margins? Is it going to be portrait or landscape? What's the default font? This is maybe one that people would change is as soon as they go in, they might say, okay, well, typically we use Alba or, you know, whatever it actually is. You can go ahead and have a default rather than having to change every single field, and then also what size. Okay. So a couple of items in here, obviously you can kind of scroll through, but each section is going to be set up a little bit different. So you'll notice one says report header. So everything in this box is the report header. Then you have something like a page header. Then you have details. So page header typically means that this information is only going to show once, whereas the detail might actually show several times. And what I mean by that is in here, I just have one line, but if I had a multi-line invoice, then what would happen is this detail section could show multiple times. So I have @line subject, that would be creative direction. And then if my next one was account management and my next one was art and creative, well, then I might have 3 different lines that show because I have the line subject and then I have the total for each. So creative direction might be $100. Account management might be $200 and so on. So it'll actually go through, and this section, this detail section, could repeat. So if you put something like a project description, so I have project description on the header because I only want it to show once, but technically I can have this field down here. What's going to happen is if I put that project description in on, so project description, it's actually going to show account management, you know, $100, and then it would have the whole project description. And then if I have a second line, maybe that one's creative direction, I have creative direction, $250, and then the project description again. So just be careful with where you're actually going in and adding your fields, because if it's in a detail section, it's possible that it repeats over and over and over. Okay, so just be careful with those. Then you have a page footer. This would be helpful for if you want to say, okay, well, this is page 1 of, you know, 3, and then 2 of 3 and 3 of 3. Next, you have the report footer. So you saw my summary had things like labor summary, expense summary, total non-tax. If we don't use tax altogether, then of course I can remove this whole grid altogether. So just hit my delete button on my computer, or you have the trash can over here. Either one will do it. Hit OK, and then sales tax is gone altogether. Okay. If you're not finding what you're looking for in here, then you have components. This is all of the available fields, even custom fields, that we can add into the actual layout. So typically, where do you want it? So you'll see things like invoice header. Those would be things like the client name and the address, and you know, maybe you even have terms in there or whatever. But those would be the fields that you would typically add up here. So each section is going to be a little bit different. You even have something like a label. This is the ability of just free typing in something. So all of these that aren't an @ they're just labels, meaning we free type to say, okay, I want invoice number to be listed here. So it's invoice number. And that's what that is basically whenever you bring it in, it'll just call it label. And then you can just type in whatever you want. Could be as long as short as or as short as you want. Again, it defaulted Arial because on that settings tab, I put Arial in 10, and then should it be italicized, bold, and then you're basically just going through those options. So just like I mentioned, make sure you're word wrapping whatever you need to, and then you can go in and kind of drag that wherever you need it to. Right. And again, you can expand. So it can expand this way. I can expand this way. For this label, obviously, I don't really need that, but that's what that would give you the options to do. The other components were people like lines, right? So if I kind of need a break somewhere, then I can go in and actually move that line and you can expand it out. So, you know, some people like big breaks somewhere in there. You have different things like lines, vertical. You can also do shapes. Click into here. It's a rectangle, or you can do any of those options. I don't really have a whole lot of people using the shapes, so you know, whatever. But if you need a logo in there and there's no option for the logo already, right? So if this wasn't here, image is definitely your logo or some sort of image that you want. And then to actually add the image, you're double clicking. It's going to pull up your computer. You go in and find the file, hit open, and then that would actually add in that image there. You also have things like the page number, total pages, when was it printed. Some people like those. And so of course you're just basically clicking and dragging the field wherever you want it. So if I needed to add in, you know, total pages, I'll click in and drag. You'll notice some sections don't allow you. So you'll have kind of that, that little circle with a line through it. It's basically saying certain sections don't have the option for that particular field. So just be careful with where you're trying to add something. Again, certain things will make sense in certain places, others will not. You can kind of go through and look at all the fields that we have. If you're not sure what they are, they should be pretty self-explanatory, but there is an invoice and estimate layout guide that you can kind of take a look at, and that should explain some of them. But you're basically clicking and dragging things in. So click and drag wherever you want it, drop it. It'll always come in with that label field because we assume that, you know, that's something, or it's easier to have it default in. And then of course, if you don't want it, you can quickly go in and delete it. But it's a nice way to have it where if you've kind of labeled all of your fields like this, then it's just easy if that defaulted in along with it. There was another question for the page footer on an invoice. Can we have a block of text? Yes. So that's going to be that label section, right? So if down here, I need some sort of like terms, conditions type of deal, you're going to do a label. And I usually expand them out pretty big, as much, you know, as much as possible. And then you can go in and actually, you know, cut and paste, because a lot of people have it somewhere. So you might have it in a Word document or an example of one of your invoices. So you can actually copy and paste it into this text field, and then it would then have whatever your verbiage is show for that. So yes, you can do blocks of text. I, again, recommend it being the label, expand it out as much as you can, and then, you know, you can continue to work on it, you know, making it bigger if you need to. But yeah, you can have those big blocks of text. Okay, so let me get rid of this. So once you've kind of figured out what do I have in here and how does it show, the next thing would actually be to test it out, right? So I'm going to remove a few things that really I don't have a lot of information for, like client project number. That's not the same as project number. And if you're not familiar with it, typically means it's not something that you are using. So now that I've made some changes to it, I can go ahead and save it. Again, that is overwriting whatever we're in. So that's why I said make the copy of the original, so that if I completely mess this up or I need to revert it back to what it was, well, then I have the original in there and I'm working on the actual estimate, or sorry, the actual copy of it. So you're kind of toggling back and forth. I made that new one. So now when I come in here, I probably need to close this out and go back in, but you would go in and it's called the webinar test. So if I want to type it in, I can. I just have to remove all of this. There's webinar tests, go ahead and save. And then you can go in and print and see what does it actually look like. So there's the line that I added in. And then again, I just have that one line in there. So it's creative direction, and that's what it's showing. Couple of items to mention would be there is some settings in here that you may want to go in and actually edit. So in here, if I need to change the name of it, I can. These 3 or 2 fields only go to estimates. Okay, so this only matters to estimates. So if I change any of this, this is not going to change any part of my invoice because these are estimate only fields. And that is in, if you're in here and if you go to, I think it's just like invoice layouts. Of course, it's not going to find it for me, but there would be, there it is, invoice and estimates layout. Again, we do have a guide for this. But what I was mentioning was when you're in that settings section, it'll say the following settings only affect the estimate. So again, does not matter what you put in here. This will not affect your invoice. Okay, so if you're like, hey, I changed this and it's still showing all kinds of detail on my invoice. Well, again, these fields have nothing to do with invoices. They have everything to do with the estimates. Okay, and then the following section, so past those 3 that I was mentioning, there is one that does apply to both the invoice and the estimates. It's this section here. So what this is going to do is show all of your items in the system, and then if there's actually billing items, it'll show the billing item and then what items are under it. This over here determines how detailed do we go on the invoice. So if I have a billing item called media, if all of those items are on the invoice, do I want it to actually show the transactions? If so, then I have it saying sub item details, and then each of the items, if I set it to transaction, then when I have an invoice, it'll have media as a header. And then under it, it might say, okay, well, cable spot was $150, you know, and then the internet media is 150. If there are certain transactions that you don't want it to show in here, you could say no detail. So usually you're just doing either no detail or transactions for each individual item. If you've gone in and kind of messed around with all of these, and you say, okay, we've kind of messed it up, I don't really like how it's showing, you have this reset items to default. But once you do this, you cannot undo it. Okay, so when I go in and do it, say yes, it now goes and reverts back to everything. So a lot of these are going to be at no detail. So if I do want it to show some of those actual transactions, then I need to go in and say, okay, I want this to be transactions. And then you're just basically going through and editing those. Otherwise, what will happen is all of my services that don't have transactions showing, they're just all going to be lumped under professional services. Going to say professional services, and then the total for every single one of those items, rather than professional services and listing out account management, and that was 3,000. General admin was 2,500, and so on. So just know that this section has a huge impact on how your invoice actually shows. Okay, because in here, on my invoice, yes, this one was created and it shows the actual service. And it was, you know, a total of 3,200. There were a couple of different labor transactions that's creating that total, but does it actually indicate or show each of those different transactions? Okay, so those details are going to be huge as far as what actually shows on the invoice when we print it out. Because I might have a line that just says maybe the task name, maybe this was task name instead, but in that task we had a bunch of labor and or expenses. If I just wanted to show the task name on the invoice, then this is set up for that. If this had transactions showing, it might show the task name and then also the actual transactions that make up the total for that task. Okay. So definitely important to note is this section will play a huge role in whether something actually prints that detail or not. And again, that was in the settings tab of the actual invoice. Okay, so settings, this is the section here. Again, these 3 sections only apply to estimates. Okay. The other part of invoices is actually how you create the invoice. That plays a role in how detailed it goes as well. So I'm going to bill from the billing tab. If you bill from each individual project, you're also going to have those same options. But in my billing tab, I had set up a couple of different projects. I'm going to go to time and materials first for my webinar client and search. I have one project in there. It shows a budget, but here's my to bill. So this is ultimately what I have to bill. So it's time and materials, meaning it's billing actuals. If I want to know what the actuals are, you can click in. And so I have account management and admin, and I also have some items. So one of my items is iStock photos. The other one is this outsourced, yeah, so you'll see vendor invoice in here. So I have a couple of vendor invoices. The rest of it are labor. Great. So this is what's making up the totals for this. You don't have to go into this screen if you'd already kind of looked at it and you said, okay, well, that looks good. Now I want to bill from here because maybe we're billing multiple projects at the same time, or you're just billing the one, that's fine. But you go in and you hit that generate option. If you're billing from within the project, then you are seeing this section, right? So this is exactly what it looks like whenever you click the billing tab in the project. You get to see all of the transactions, and then you can decide, do I want to bill everything? You can check the box for everything, or you can uncheck certain things and hit bill. But either of those options, this line format is huge on how detailed the invoice can be. Okay, so with this, you have a couple of options. Do I just do one line? So I have like, I think 10 different items or so, and that's labor and expenses. Do I just show one line and it's going to total my 73.51? Do I go per task? So all of these items, all of my services are linked to a task, right? Because when I put time, I have to choose task, one per service and item. So again, this is going to play a huge role in how detailed or how summary my invoice is actually going to be. Okay, so this matters. Once you've chosen this, there's not a whole lot that you can do to go back except for just delete it and start over if you chose the wrong one. Okay. So I'm going to go back into here. Again, that was if you're billing the individual project. Otherwise, if you click from here, you still get that same option of how detailed do I go? Do I just kind of have one line that basically says 73.50? Or again, do I go by task and service item, billing item, or billing item and item? So if I just do that one line item and hit generate, then when I go in, I'm going to close out. This is the invoice that it actually created. When I click into it, I don't remember what default I have. So I have this invoice and estimate layouts. You'll notice that it's just one line, right? But tucked into that line are all the expenses and all of the labor. But this is not going to show detail of labor and expenses. It's just showing the one line. Okay, so just keep in mind that it's only ever going to have really one line. I'm not going to see multiple lines, and those lines are going to be labeled as like service and item and all of that because I just created one line. If I do it again and create it again in a different way, we're going to see different options. So click on it, it's the same project, same total, generate. If I choose something like service and item, we're going to see a lot more items, right? We're going to see the account management. We're going to see, right? So a lot of lines in here. Okay. So again, that's huge in what actually shows. So this is a lot of lines. All of these are going to show on my invoice. If this is too many, then I needed to do something like billing item and items. Now, I don't have a whole lot of my my services linked to billing items, but I have a few of them. So, you know, right now we see quite a few different options in here. If I use that billing item and item, it should reduce it by a few at least. So again, if I choose something like billing item and item, generate, then again, we'll see a few less lines than before, right? So here's my billing items and then the actual items. Okay, so now I have kind of like a top line and then a subline under it because we said, okay, billing item and the actual item. Billing item would just be reimbursed out-of-pocket costs, other outsourced items, professional services. Okay. So again, that's going to play a huge role in what your invoices look like. Someone had a question of sometimes an invoice prints 2 pages instead of 1. I heard your point about the detail section being repeatable. So I added an at subject and at total. However, the invoice in question still prints 2 lines instead of having 2 line subjects. It'd probably be something that we'd have to take offline because we're not going to do each individual ones. So I would say send that over to your account manager and then they can kind of take a look at what's going on with that. Okay, so then again, you can play around with this because there's no harm in, trying each one to see, well, what detail does that give me? And then try it out with your layout. So whatever layout you chose, if I did that webinar test and go ahead and hit save, then when I go in and print it, what does it look like? So obviously I have some spacing problems. I have a lot of sizing problems as well because this is really big, this one's really small. So I want to move this line down a little bit. I want to expand it to where my P actually shows for expenses. So I need to make that line bigger. So here's what I would typically do. Let me move this over. I would go into my webinar test. If I can find it. There it is. So if I go in here, again, I need to be on the invoice side. So I saw that on my invoice, the label for expense needs to be a little bit bigger. So I would scroll down. This is the label for it right here. So I need to make that a little bit bigger, right? And so that one's probably set. Then I would go through, I'd probably move that line down a little bit. So I have this needing to be expanded out. So you're basically just going through and kind of making those small corrections in order to accommodate for how that actually showed. And if I don't really want this whole expense grid all together, because you're seeing the line subject is the actual outsourced item, right? And then it's showing me this whole expense grid. Do I need this expense grid or not? Do I want to show the actual details of it, or do I just show the other outsourced? My lines or my totals over here, again, were all different. So this one was in this italicized, so probably want to unitalicized it. Maybe I want this to be a 9 instead of an 8. And then in here, do I also want all of this detail? So again, make small corrections and then go through and and print it again, right? So go through, print. I know I probably fixed my expense not having the P cut off. I'd still go through and figure out what else needs. So I like the font here. This looks good, and just continue to tweak as necessary. Okay. So hopefully that gave you enough to figure out how to actually do those layouts. Again, the biggest thing that I would recommend is don't edit the defaults, just go in and make a copy, because then if you don't like how it turned out, there's really no going back, because after you've saved it, that undo button really won't work if you've closed out of the whole thing. So just be mindful of how you're going in and actually copying the layout and then utilize them. And again, have some sort of invoice that you can continue to test until you've got it right. And then once you have it all set up, then each client can list what layout they would use, right? So again, it's under that billing. This is my actual client record. You have your defaults here. Layouts, again, will always override templates. Okay, so if I have both listed, whenever I print out the invoice or the estimate, this one's going to win as far as what detail does it use. Okay, so you can have both listed, but just know if you've put all of your time into working on those layouts, then go ahead and just list your actual layouts. Okay, and then if I set this to webinar and I save, any invoice created from that point forward for this client called webinar, it'll default to that particular layout. Okay, so one question was, can you paste the link where this workshop recording will live? Yes. let me get into the help guide. If I go back to webinars, it should be here. So let me find the chat, paste. And again, it usually takes a couple of days, so you won't see it today. You probably won't see it tomorrow, but possibly by Thursday or Friday, you would be able to see it. So again, any questions on an actual invoice and or layout that you have, go ahead and send it to support@workamajig.com. That'll get to your account manager. There's 3 things that we need. Okay, most important thing that we need to in order to troubleshoot is what invoice or estimate are you using? So what layout, right? And then what actual invoice. So if I have invoice, 10-482, tell me what invoice you're using. Tell me what layout or template you're using, and then make a print of it and say, okay, I can't get this to move over here. So give me examples of what it is that's wrong, because that's the easiest way for us to kind of figure out how we can help. So those 3 items is, what's the invoice or estimate that you're using? What layout or template are you using? And then what's actually wrong, right? So what should go where, what's missing, what can't you get it to do? Details are definitely important. Otherwise, we kind of go back and forth on what it is that you're looking for. Okay. Okay, well, thank you all for attending the webinar. Again, link will be posted soon. If you have any questions, you can email support@workamajig.com and that'll get directly to your account manager. Thank you and have a great day.